Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Spotlight Podcast. My name is Blake Reiter. I'm the Director of Hospitality Research here at Lighthouse. And with me is the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Daniel Foreman. Daniel, say hi, please.
Hey, everybody. This is Daniel. I'm a commercial strategist here at Lighthouse with 10 years of revenue management experience. So very happy to be here looking over this exciting new survey response that we have.
Yes, so today we are going to be diving into this survey. We recently surveyed 761 commercial leaders across 6 continents, and that included revenue managers and C-suite execs and sales and marketing leaders, and many of the questions centered on the topic of where does the industry actually stand on AI today, and how does it compare to the future? When we set out to design the survey, I would say we had a hypothesis. We assumed that we would find an industry that is largely charging confidently towards AI with more adoption, more integration, and more, I would say, overall sophistication. But what we found was a bit more complicated than that, and I would say actually more interesting, because what came through was more of a story of an industry that genuinely believes that the future is AI-driven, but largely admits that it is not prepared for that shift. So today we're going to really dive into this question of what does it really mean to operate in an increasingly AI-driven world. So Daniel, could you kind of set the stage for us? What did we do? Who did we talk to?
Let's break these down a little bit and talk about where these respondents are coming from, what their business type is, region, role, that sort of thing. So we had USA and Canada representing the largest cohort at 32%, followed by Asia Pacific at 26%. Europe at 25%. And then let's touch on some of the major roles that responded. So revenue management came in at number 1. They were 36% of respondents. That was followed by operations at 24% and sales at 18%. And then looking at business type, about 35% of respondents say that they work for a global hotel chain, but we've got a really good mix in here as well. It's very balanced. 29% said that they worked for independent hotels, and then 16% for management companies. So long story short, with this sample size, it's a really good representation, a global representation across 6 continents, kind of from all walks of life here.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America as well, with a aggregate about 16%. So very, very diverse. So let's dive into the data. First and foremost, we wanted to understand, we asked, how much of an impact does AI have on your company's current commercial strategy? Now, these are the responses, and it's interesting. It looks like an almost perfect bell curve. The average came in at 3.02 out of 5. So AI, as it relates to commercial strategy, still appears to be in this early adopter stage. But I think here's what's interesting, okay? We did a survey in 2024 and asked the exact same question. And when we did that, the average was almost identical. The average was 3.06, so ostensibly flat in terms of the average. And the response buckets were almost identical. So despite all the conversation around AI over the past 2 years, practical adoption hasn't really moved meaningfully, even as future expectations have essentially surged. And you know, I think what else is interesting is that if you examine the early adopters who are most commonly rating it a 5 out of 5 in terms of current impact, the group that was most represented was largely comprised of, for these 5 out of 5s, of marketing managers, operations leaders, and revenue management consulting companies. So not revenue managers specifically, but revenue management consulting companies. And if you break it down by portfolio size, groups managing 51 to 100 hotels had the highest aggregate score at 3.4, while single property operators scored the lowest at 2.8. So overall, I think the key takeaway here is that at this moment in time, from a commercial strategy standpoint, AI is currently neither absent nor transformative for most hoteliers. It remains in the early adopter stage, and this hasn't changed significantly since the 2024 survey. But I think the averages kind of mask a bit of a divide geographically. So, Daniel, when we look at it by region, the picture is more nuanced. Talk to me about that.
We asked respondents, how much of an impact does AI have on your company's current commercial strategy? And you can see how the scores differ across the different regions. So the lowest score in the set was actually Europe, which came in at a 2.7. And then contrast that with Asia Pacific, which was the highest, where respondents gave that a score of a 3.3. Now, what's also interesting is that in some of the different markets like Africa, which came in at a 3.2, and Latin America and Middle East that each came in at 3.1, they're actually outpacing North America, which I thought was also very surprising. So that may show how some of these markets that potentially don't have that deep legacy tech stack infrastructure may be able to adopt AI a little bit more nimbly, maybe be a little bit more flexible with how they roll out AI. So just some food for thought there on why we're seeing this difference between these different regions.
And so to frame who's kind of adopting AI fastest, we wanted to group today's AI users into these three personas, okay? So first we have we call them the power user. They have an adoption score of about 3.8 out of 5. And this represents from our data marketing managers across all sizes and regions. Now, they're the furthest ahead in AI integration. And if you think about it, I think it really makes sense because marketing managers are writing tons of copy, and using AI for copywriting is pretty much everywhere at this point, I would say. The growing adopter, we classify them around 3.1 out of 5, and this is groups like revenue managers at mid to large chains. And these growing adopters they're building momentum, but they haven't yet reached, we'll call it full integration. And here's why I think this is. The work of these professionals is extremely high stakes, with every pricing decision having immediate dollar consequences. And I think that creates a very high trust threshold before they let AI into their workflow. Because you can compare that to marketing managers who can let AI draft copy and then they can iterate, and usually lower risk if something is off. So I think that is probably why revenue managers are perhaps more hesitant to experiment. And if you think about it, on top of that, revenue managers at these types of groups, their work is pretty embedded in proprietary PMS and RMS systems, and they can't just open ChatGPT to get value. The AI has to integrate into their actual tech stack, which is a much heavier lift. And and mid to large chains typically have enough legacy infrastructure to make that integration pretty painful. So more on that later. General managers were in a similar range at around 3. And I think that's because they're generalists by design, because, they touch every department, but they own none of them really deeply. So they have, broad curiosity, I would say, about AI, but no single, we'll call it a high urgency use case pulling them towards mastery. Lastly, we have the cautious observer, and these are groups at a 2.4 adoption score, and this represents asset managers for the most part. And they're really watching from the sidelines. I was thinking about why this might be, and I think it's because asset managers, they're often representing ownership groups or institutional investors, and introducing AI into their analyses or their recommendations, it carries reputational and also, I would say, fiduciary risk that most other roles don't face in the same way. If you're wondering how independents and chains kind of fit into this whole thing, broadly, chains scored around 3.1, pretty much in that growing adopter camp. Independents, they're hovering around 2.9, so they're in that gap between the cautious observer and the growing adopters. And I think this is interesting because in 2024, when we did the previous survey, independents and chains were both in that growing adopter camp. And since then, independents have drifted downward while chains have kind of held steady. So this is, I would say, a divergence that's worth watching because the two groups were nearly identical 2 years ago, and now a bit of a gap has opened. So a little bit more on that later. But Daniel, why don't you now talk to us about how is AI being used by people that are adopting it?
So you can see right there at the top of the list, data and analytics is in first place. That's 55% of respondents said that they're currently using AI for this purpose. And that's followed really closely by market analysis at 54%. Also, in the top three, you've got pricing decisions at 47%. And then that's followed by other things like competitor benchmarking and then personalization and customization. Let's double click on the personalization and customization piece of this. Now, this is noteworthy because we know how much potential there is for personalization in the future for that to really drive direct bookings. So I think this is definitely one to watch that, as we come back to the survey in coming years, I would expect this to skyrocket over time because that's really going to be a big area where AI can make some major improvements. And then notably, you'll see that 17% of respondents say that they do not use AI at all. Now, if we kind of harken back to our 2024 survey that we did, this number has dropped a ton. When we did the 2024 survey, 37% of respondents said that they do not use AI at all. So there's definitely been more experimentation, more people at least trying out AI over the past 2 years. So big improvement here. And of those 131 respondents who said that they don't use AI at all on this survey, nearly 2/3 or 64% of them are coming from portfolios that are only 1 to 5 hotels in size. So the absolute smallest portfolio size in this respondent pool. So a takeaway here is that we're seeing more AI adoption with the larger portfolios and then perhaps a little bit more hesitation with the absolute smallest portfolio size. But I'll turn it over to you, Blake, now to talk about some of the barriers, some of the things that might be slowing people down from their AI adoption.
Totally. Yep. So what we wanted to do now is really dive into those who responded a 1 or a 2 for the current impact of AI on their commercial strategies. And if you're wondering why the numbers add up to more than 100%, this was a check all that apply question. So, like I said, we dove into the barriers, and when we asked what was holding organizations back, integration challenges, okay? Integrating with existing systems came in as the number one barrier at 41%. And when we broke this down by portfolio size buckets, so 1 to 5 hotels, 6 to 50, 51 to 100, and 101 plus, for every single bucket, integration was the number one or number two response. And I find this fascinating. Small portfolios, single property operators, cited integration, and big portfolios too. And I certainly can understand it being daunting to integrate into a big portfolio of properties, but these big groups are the ones that have the resources. No clear use case, it followed at 39%. These are the people that can't really articulate how AI fits into their workflow. And so I don't think it's a technology problem. I think that's a communication and education problem. And the number suggests that, the conversations surrounding what does this mean for my day-to-day hasn't really happened enough. So the data shows that the real blockers are strategic and organizational. Difficulty trusting AI outputs at 34% reveals a significant trust barrier for a third of this bucket of respondents. And so it's not a phobia of technology. These are commercial professionals who have built their careers on being right about numbers. So the question isn't, do you believe AI is capable? It's, are you willing to stake your reputation on its output? And asking them to hand decisions to a machine is a genuinely hard ask. Budget constraints rank 6th at 28%, and perceived complexity comes in last at 25%. And I think this is an important finding too, because money is not the primary obstacle. The real blockers are technical integration, strategic clarity, and trust. And now we want to switch gears and look at what it means for the construct of your team. So Daniel, let's dive into this.
All right, let's talk about the impact of AI on staffing. And we're going to start with an impact on today's teams. When we drill into the specific staffing impacts for existing teams, 57% are reporting no impact yet. And that's by far the largest group. Then you've got 24% who are saying that AI is expanding their capabilities. This means that AI is allowing their existing staff to do more. Now, this goes a bit hand in hand with only 4% down here that are reporting reductions to headcount. As we talked about earlier, we're kind of in this early adoption phase. So it's not like AI has come in and jobs are being slashed left and right. That's simply not what we're seeing here. And then you have 14% of respondents saying that they are now managing more properties, but with the same headcount. Now, this is a really important one, Blake, that you flagged, because I think this definitely has the potential to be one of the biggest impacts that teams are going to see directly from AI over the coming years. The next slide that you're about to show shows that there are some changes already happening on the hiring side of things.
Exactly. So and I think it makes sense that hiring is changing faster than staffing because it's easier to change who you bring in next rather than retrain who you already have. So let's break down how the responses looked for those respondents who indicated that AI has had at least some degree of effect on their hiring process. So first and foremost, cross-utilized talent. Almost half the respondents who reported changes to hiring said this. They selected this response. And I think this is arguably the most strategically significant finding on this slide because I think it signals that the walls between revenue management, marketing, sales, and distribution, they're starting to come down. And the future hire isn't necessarily a specialist. They're a commercial generalist who can fluidly move across functions. And that's a fundamentally different profile than what the industry has historically recruited for. More properties per revenue manager and seeking more technical talent. I think these go hand in hand a bit because you need technically sophisticated people because each one will be managing more. And the modern revenue manager basically isn't doing more of the same job. They're doing a fundamentally different job at a larger scale. And before we move on, I want to talk about the 13% that selected the reduced importance of technical proficiency. AI is absolutely functioning as a technical equalizer because tasks that used to require someone who could build models or write queries or interpret statistical outputs, they now could be approximated by someone with strong business instincts and a good prompt. So that's real. And the 13% they're picking up on something I would say that's genuine because the floor of what a non-technical person can accomplish has really risen dramatically. But the 40% who said they're seeking more technical talent, they're also correct because the nature of technical is shifting. It's not disappearing. The old technical skills of data manipulation and spreadsheet modeling, they're becoming less valuable, and the new technical skills of knowing how to evaluate AI outputs and understanding when a model is confidently wrong, those are becoming more valuable. So the 13% and the 40%, they're just using the word technical to mean different things. So, all that said, we're hiring this new breed of commercial talent, but are the teams they're joining actually set up to work well together? So, Daniel, talk to me about teams and their alignment.
All right, this was an interesting one. We asked, within your commercial team, how aligned are the sales, marketing, and revenue management and distribution functions when it comes to pricing, distribution, and total revenue strategy? The global average for internal commercial team alignment sits at a 3.5 out of 5. So that sounds reasonable until you remember that these are commercial teams, right? These are people whose entire job is coordinated execution around things like pricing and distribution and revenue. So in that context, a 3.5 isn't necessarily like, good enough, B+, but it may be a sign that nearly half the people responsible for the commercial outcomes aren't necessarily rowing in the same direction as a team. What's also interesting, perhaps a little scary, is that roughly half of all teams, or 48%, scored that at a 3 or below, which means that at best they're moderately coordinated. So let's talk about role for a second. Marketing leaders reported the lowest average alignment at 2.9. And this is worth pausing for a moment because you'll remember from earlier, these are the people who showed up as our power users for AI adoption. So these are the most technically forward members as far as AI is concerned on a lot of our teams. They're the most experimentally minded, but then they're also reporting that team alignment is lowest. And then you had sales leaders were coming in at 3.9. This was the highest of any of the roles. And after thinking on this one interpretation that we had was that perhaps salespeople are a little bit more relationship driven by nature, and perhaps that translates into a better perception of these cross-functional communications, even when the systems and the processes aren't perfect. But there's pretty big gaps in between the different roles and how they self-report as far as what their alignment is across their entire team. All right, and on the next slide, Blake, we're going to transition more so into the future and talk about how ready teams feel for this shift towards AI. Can you talk a little bit about that, Blake?
Thank you, Daniel. Exactly. We're going to dive into readiness. We're also going to dive into how much of an impact the respondents felt that AI will have on the company's future commercial strategy over the next 5 years. So right now on the screen, we'll dive into that first. Right now, this is a throwback to earlier in the presentation. This is the present day impact, that bell curve we talked about. Now I'm going to click my mouse, and this is how respondents felt about the future impact of AI. And you can see it's completely different. The mean expected AI impact jumps from 3.02 to 3.86, gap of 0.84 points. Few things I want to point out here. Over 67% of respondents gave a future impact of a 4 or a 5. And when we asked the same question back in 2024, that number was 60% out of 4 or a 5. So future conviction is actually growing, even as current adoption has stayed flat. So the industry is becoming more and more certain about where AI is headed, while simultaneously not moving meaningfully towards it. So this might be an uncomfortable feeling for anyone watching this that's kind of in that cautious observer camp. I also want to point out that for respondents with 100 or more properties, they were averaging a 4.2 average future impact, highest of any segment. And I think there's a reason that these enterprise operators are more bullish, because AI gets more powerful with the more data it has to work with. So a 500 property portfolio generates exponentially more signal for the AI to work with than a 5 property portfolio. So these big operators can already see the compounding returns that smaller operators are perhaps still waiting to experience. So, Daniel, now this is kind of the elephant in the room. This is the most important slide, I think, in the deck. And this is the readiness one. So talk to me now, please.
Yeah, let's talk about the level of readiness for this coming shift to AI. So a combined 44% of respondents said that they were either unprepared or they were aware but inactive. So it's a little bit of a gut punch, right? That nearly half the industry is either doing nothing or they know that they should be doing something, but they're still not taking action yet. So remember, this is against a backdrop where already 67% of respondents have already said that they expect a high future impact for AI. And beyond that, I think this is one of the most important stats, is that 175 respondents rated the anticipated future impact a 4 or a 5, but they admit to being currently either unprepared or inactive. So that's nearly a quarter of the entire survey sample holding two basically contradictory positions at the same time. And you've only got 10% that say that they feel fully prepared. Now, that's not the end of the world. 10% sounds like a small number, but the bigger story is more so the trajectory, right? It isn't, are you fully prepared today? But I think the bigger, more important question is, what does your path to being prepared for AI actually look like?
Exactly, Daniel. And so obviously you were just talking about readiness at a macro level. Let's actually look at it, independence versus chains, because we talked about this earlier about a bit of a divide starting to form between independence and chains. So here's I think the kind of the smoking gun here. Okay, so 53% of independents are unprepared or inactive versus 40% for chains. And I think that gap matters enormously when you layer it on top of everything else we've already established. Independents have lower adoption today, lower future conviction, and now lower readiness. So each of these, I think, individually is manageable, but together they describe somewhat of a compounding disadvantage that gets more difficult to close with as time kind of goes by. So I think when it comes to readiness, here's the takeaway. Everyone listening to this presentation falls into one of the 4 buckets that we're kind of defining. And I think the aware but inactive 33%, they're the most important people listening because they've already done the hardest part, right? The understanding of what's happening. The only thing standing between them and in progress is making that decision. So as we look towards the future and how AI will continue to impact the industry, we also wanted to understand where respondents felt would be the biggest impact when we look ahead. So where will AI actually have the biggest commercial decision-making impact? So Daniel, talk to me about that And I know obviously this is a check all that applies, so more than
Mhm.
100% on the slide.
Yeah, so let's talk about where respondents said that the biggest future impacts of AI were going to be. We've got data analytics and business intelligence coming in at 64% of respondents agreed with that. That's followed by dynamic pricing and rate optimization. So analytics and pricing dominating this list, I don't think is too surprising. Because, of course, these are areas where AI has already that most established track record within hospitality. And in a lot of cases, that's where its ROI is already most measurable. But then you've also got 29% for guest personalization and targeting, which perhaps sounds reasonable until you remember what personalization actually represents. That's the primary lever for driving those direct bookings and building lasting guest relationships. And one final point we'll make about this slide that's really interesting is that those two top responses, data analytics and BI, and then the dynamic pricing and price optimization, that was unanimous across all the different regions. And when you do a big survey like this, it's very rare that you get everybody agreeing about the top two on anything. But question for you, Blake, does that differ at all based on the roles within the organizations that responded to the survey?
Yes, it does, and it's super super interesting. So C-suite leaders, their top pick was dynamic pricing. 54% of respondents said this, and let's just dissect this for a moment. Dynamic pricing, it's the most visible, it's the most boardroom friendly AI adoption in hospitality. It's easy to point to, it's easy to measure, and it's easy to sell internally. But it raises a question worth, I think, posing. Are C-suite leaders prioritizing dynamic pricing because it's genuinely the highest value AI application, or is it because it's one that they can most easily explain to the owners and the investors? So I think there's a difference between the AI future that's easiest to communicate and the one that's most strategically important. These are just things I'm thinking about. We saw revenue managers prioritizing data analytics and BI. 72% of respondents that are revenue managers said that because they want better tools for the work they do every day. More data, better data, faster data. That makes sense. But here's what's interesting. If revenue managers are primarily looking to AI to do their current job better, rather than to fundamentally reimagine what their job could be, they may be optimizing for a role that itself could look very different in 5 years. It's just interesting food for thought. Using AI to be a better version of today's revenue manager is not necessarily using it to become tomorrow's commercial architect. So the through line here is that every role is largely looking at AI's future through the lens of their own function. C-suite see a pricing lever. Revenue managers see a better calculator. Marketing sees a content and campaign engine because they lean towards marketing optimization. And that's the alignment probably we were talking about and how it's manifesting itself and how people think about the future. So the industry doesn't just need AI strategy, it needs shared AI strategy. So we'll leave you on that and then we'll dive into these key takeaways. So let's bring it all together. Here are the 5 kind of things that everyone watching should kind of take away from what we talked about today. Daniel, kick it off.
All right. The first one there is the expectation gap is real and it's widening. So the single most important finding in this entire presentation we've given you is that distance between what the industry believes is coming, but what it's actually doing about it today. So those adoption scores, like we talked about, are essentially flat from our survey from 2 years ago in 2024, but that future conviction is accelerating.
Number 2 are knowing what your blockers are. The key blockers, it's integration complexity, strategic clarity, and it's trust. And these are not solved by writing a bigger check. It's not a resource issue. They're solved by making decisions, by building internal alignment, and starting somewhere specific rather than waiting for a perfect condition that isn't necessarily coming.
And then the third takeaway is that AI is not replacing your team. It is instead raising the bar for them. So this ties back to the staffing topic that we talked about earlier. Only 4% of respondents were reducing headcounts. The replacement narrative is largely not materializing, but what is happening is quieter and it's more consequential. So the same number of people are now being asked to do more, cover more properties, and operate more strategically. And the revenue manager of tomorrow isn't doing less because of AI. They're just doing a fundamentally different job, but now it's at a larger scale.
Next one is to get your commercial team aligned before you add technology. And we saw the average commercial team alignment score is 3.5 out of 5, with nearly half of respondents sitting at a 3 or below. And highly aligned teams reported meaningfully higher AI readiness scores. So ultimately, you have to fix the foundation before you can build the house. Critical. And Daniel, bring it on home.
The last takeaway is that independent hotels have a compounding problem and it requires urgent attention. So this one is specifically for the indie hoteliers that may be watching this, but that lower adoption today means lower future conviction and lower readiness in general. So each of these, thankfully, is individually manageable. Together, they describe a trajectory that gets harder to reverse with every passing quarter, though. So the chains aren't slowing down to wait for you to catch up. The time to close the gap is right now, not when that tipping point arrives later.
So all in all, awareness without action, it is not a viable strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Spotlight webinar. Catch up on every episode in our podcast feed. This webinar series is now going to be monthly, so twice as often as it previously had been. And we also have weekly quick takes and other content going to that feed. So check it often. Great content constantly going to that podcast feed. Really quickly, you're going to see a button on your screen that asks if you want to be contacted by a member of our sales team. If you do, just click yes. If you don't, you can click no or just sign off. But if you're interested in how Lighthouse can enhance your commercial strategy, click yes and start that process, and someone from our sales team will reach out to you. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a pleasure as always. My name is Blake Reiter.
I'm Daniel Foreman.
And we will see you guys next time on the Spotlight podcast. Thank you again for tuning in.